all for being here today. We're wrapping up the end of the water year and looking towards the next year and trying to prepare for that. With that, I'll let Amir start with the subbasin updates. We did have a meeting with the State Water Resource Control Board today for the Tule subbasin, so I'll let Amir give a recap on that.
So we literally just got off this call here about 10 minutes ago. Most of the call, half the call was dedicated to the new methodology proposed for the Tule subbasin for water levels. The other half of the meeting was focused on some of the discussion on subsidence. How do I say this? There still is an ongoing concern about the state board and state board staff view of what is occurring down here, what they understand that we're doing, or their lack of understanding on what we're doing and how we historically have handled some of these situations, and the fact that all of these issues have been ongoing for some time, and that these are not issues that are just popping up today and that we've been dealing with. So we were a little bit how do I say this politely? Dismayed.
That's polite.
That's polite. At some of the responses we got from the state board on some of the proposed water levels and methodology and subsidence. So just starting on the water level, one good thing that I think came out of the meeting, they seemed a little bit more open to the fact that we are using the groundwater model as a tool, and they certainly seemed a lot more open about that than DWR has. And I'm not sure exactly why, and the reason that that's important is model as a tool does allow us to make some predictions on what's going on. So they seemed a little bit more open to that on the water level as opposed to DWR's much more blanket statement. Some of the letters has been that they weren't interested in the predictive values of the model. So I think that was a good sign. Can't think of any other positives.
I think that they did not particularly have a problem with our coordinated methodology for water levels for the approach. I think that they thought that the methodology was solid, might be an overstatement, but the methodology was somewhat got a nod today. They are still very concerned that we're going to allow impacts to domestic wells, and it's a main concern for them. We presented a very specific, I thought, mitigation program today with real numbers and funding available to that mitigation program, and still didn't seem to dissuade their thought process on impacts to domestic well owners and their questions on that. So I was going to say, what is missing from this conversation, from my perspective, and nobody has said anything back, is the lack of consideration about economic damage that we have to balance. We have to balance economic damage to our communities and our counties and our cities and our communities. We have to balance that with domestic well ownership and protecting them to the best ability and mitigating the problems for domestic wells. But there doesn't seem to be any counterbalance in the conversation right now. Now, maybe that's going to happen at some point, but right now, from my perspective, it's the missing key to what we're talking about. It seems like that, somehow they seem to think the GSAs are going to magically come up with massive amounts of funding to mitigate everything from levee controls to bridges to domestic wells, just about anything you can think of, and they seem to think it's an unlimited funding source. So at some point, there needs to be, from my perspective, a coordinated pushback on some of these talking points. But we're not there yet in the subbasins. We're still just trying to work through what they want to see, You know, if we just talk about just the sustainable management criteria, like I said, I think they liked the methodology for setting the water levels, that was the positive that came out of it. But there's just a lot of undercurrents.
They're on the bridges, talking on
That's,
that side, like they were talking over on the King side.
Yeah.
yeah,
On the Thule side, yeah, Sweater Lake side.
So is that more associated with water levels or subsidence or both?
subsidence, I kinda jumped into subsidence with that, bridges, canals, north-south canals, there's a misunderstanding. Infrastructure of how that has been, managed in the past within water districts, and, they had a big concern with that, what's the cost of repairing that?
Right up bridges.
What's the cost of repairing all of the levees for Deer Creek Stormwater District? I mean, there's just a numerous amount of things thrown out there today that, and that we're not giving really any particular pushback yet, so I think that's gonna have to happen.
Yeah,
So basically, it's the blame's one direction.
Yes.
oh, yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Oh,
100%.
yeah, there's no finger, not even a suggestion of a finger being pointed the other way, yeah, no, it's all one-sided. The domestic wells, so the number of wells that were gonna be impacted by this new methodology was roughly about 18% of the wells in sub-basin, if you use the Oscar database, and that's a different issue to debate. And they felt that 18% was way too high. That 18% is, as we've talked about at the Tri-County Board, is $24 million. They still felt like, A, that 18% was too high, and B, that $24 million is too low of a number.
So I just wanna make sure I understand this right. 18% of all the wells in the sub-basin
Yeah.
are domestic wells.
No, 18% of all the wells in the sub-basin would go dry at the new water levels that we're proposing.
And that doesn't have anything to do with domestic, it's just all wells.
All wells, but they tend to be all domestic.
So, and what we're talking about is so we have to set these minimum thresholds, right, and then we have measurable objectives. The minimum thresholds where we're really not supposed to operate or go under, so it would be that 18% would happen only if we hit that threshold or went under, So if we stay in our operation flexibility, it's less than that still.
Right.
But they pointed out pretty quickly, that was 1 in 5, and they didn't think that was gonna be acceptable, but we're getting to water levels in the Tule that keep raising them, there's gonna be a significant effect on what operation's gonna be left in the Tule subbasin. Getting close.
Yeah, I mean, these water levels have already been raised from the last report, and yeah, there's a potential that some wells are gonna be impacted, but you have to balance it, as Deanna said, and that's where the discussion is not taking place on the economic impact. If we have to maintain water levels at a certain value, what that would mean to the growers in this area and the agricultural community and all the businesses that are dependent upon that. So, and again, we proposed, or there was a number proposed of $24 million to mitigate those wells, and that was felt to be too low. And I was like, wow, man, I don't know where you guys. That's why I was asking that question earlier, Susan, about how much money is in the SAFER fund.
Well, it's $130 million a year, what I was just reading. It's broken out, over technical assistance, but the main priority is for,
And that's statewide, the 130.
that's statewide. I couldn't find anything that broke it down by region.
Okay.
But I know a week or so ago, I was in a meeting, and they were projecting what that cost looks like, so we could, what the mitigation amounts would be.
Yeah.
And I had a concern on how we're determining that mitigation amount. And I understand there's other programs out there, and so there was some reliance on, well, we're gonna work with self-help enterprises, because they're already providing this and that. But all that money is coming from State Water Resources Control Board, and I'm thinking, they don't want that they don't want their money to be going to that. So they're wanting the GSAs to put up all of that money, and those figures are not being calculated in that mitigation process. Because the numbers that are being put up for mitigation, they won't even buy a tank to put on the property.
And none of this will be available to us then? None of that would be available to us?
I don't know that that's the answer, but that's the way it sounds to me. I suspect in my working with them that they do not want to be able to have to provide those funds at all to mitigate wells that go dry, domestic wells, to other agencies. They want that to be handled on the local level by the GSA.
State staff will say, and at least one board member will say, that safer funding is for legacy issues, and that the GSA's continued overdraft, they have to come up with the money for that.
And, you know,
What,
to,
define the legacy issue.
Probably anything, that was done before this safer program was, so if you're.
Anything that was identified.
Identified, yeah.
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 How many,
Pre-stigma.
is 18, how many wells is that, Mary? When we say 18%?
It was,
400.
421 wells,
like that.
something like that.
421,
I don't know, like,
30-something in Tri-County? 30,
421, yeah.
Averaging this, my math, or that's 60,000 a well,
About 76,000 roughly per well,
it's 1 million.
yeah. And we, Dan and I, have argued internally, to the Tule subbasin that we would like to have that calculated a different way. And, you know, we're not looking to put up $24 million, because as Deanna said, that's the level we want to avoid.
Right.
The water level we want to avoid, that would cause 400 wells to go dry. But on the other hand, you know, $24 million is an unreasonable amount of money to expect that someone's gonna have to pay on each pump, you know, each acre foot of water pumped. And it needs to be inclusive of every pumper in the subbasin, not just those of us that have transitional pumping.
all that isn't gonna happen in 1 year.
No, not 1 year.
So it's gonna be
Right.
some
Yeah.
horizon, so you.
Right,
That's right.
yeah, that's right. But it's just a lot of money. That's only about the wells, right, that we've talked about. As Deanna mentioned, the state is very open, or very much expecting, I should say, the mitigation or subsidence impacts are also going to have separate mitigation funding by the GSAs. And, you know, that starts getting into expensive infrastructure.
Well, those bridges that they're harping on now, my God, is that because of all the flooding, the flood flows, they saw how many bridges were low?
I imagine, because he keeps, you know, one of the staff continues to talk about Freeport and,
Right.
you know, that they gets wiped out because, you know, there's no Freeport left and.
Yeah, scour on the bridges, on the abutments, and footings on the bridges. So there's an ongoing debate with them as to, you know, they basically came back and said, you should estimate the amount of damage that's going to occur from subsidence and use that as your, you know, to calculate how much money you need to raise for mitigation. We're like, you know, this was that point that we made, Mike, at our meeting on Fleur Lake, that, hey, we're living with this, right? We've been living with it, and it's not like bridges are failing for the last 50 years that we've had subsidence.
Well, that's why I was wondering why it drew to their attention so much. I just
laser
figured it's that because they're plugging up with debris and going over the top during these last flood flows, or there was something got that on their radar.
Yeah, and you know, another thing though is they first showed the flooding that happened in Tri-County, you know, in Forest area, and I think that, you know, there's just some missing elements to that conversation. And one is this was the largest Kings River run in history that they had on record. I mean, that, you know, things are gonna happen when you have amounts of water to that extent. And so,
Well, and I think, Deanna, I don't know if people haven't analyzed it, but the further south you went, the bigger the water year was. So if that was, I know it's a record on the Kings, so all the way down to the Kern, it's, the same's gotta be true of that.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, these levees, everything was not designed for an infinite amount of water to go through. So, yeah, it's capacity issues. Just because you have a capacity issue does not mean you have a subsidence issue. Capacity and the subsidence may contribute to some of the capacity issues, but it doesn't mean that the issues that we had on the canals and the rivers were due to only subsidence.
How much about the riparian growth of Fish and Game,
Right.
it won't let us clear, and the
Right.
sedimentation in the channels, I mean, all that. That's why I don't think they're looking at all of that.
Yeah, and so, you know,
Regardless of any of that, subsidence for the Tule and Tulare Lake subbasin and Cahuilla subbasin is going to be the driving factor for pumping beneath the clay. And that is going to happen. There's going to be some sort of minimum threshold set there, and I don't think it's going to be favorable.
yeah.
So, there's just not a good way around that.
Yeah.
They're looking at that rate of subsidence, they're looking at the, 9 feet, and, it's not too long of a span of years. And that rate, we're gonna have to show a significant reduction in that rate, because they're never going to let us out of state control. Be tough. They went back on the Eastern Tule. Eastern Tule has an actual subsidence management plan that is very restrictive, has zones. It's been coordinated with the Department of Water Authority, and they basically told them today that even though the Department of Water Resources gave them a wink on that plan, that the department had questions and that they still have questions on that plan as well. So they're going back with another bite at that apple too.
On the domestic well side, what I had been hearing is they were shooting, the state subbasin as a whole was looking at 10%. But you're talking about 18 of all wells, right, which includes ag and commercial.
Yeah, yeah, that's
So-
right.
But where does that put you with domestic?
Domestics,
Wasn't domestic was the 18.
hold on a second and I'll tell you, give me,
11.
the domestics were at 18.
18, yes, domestics are the ones that.
Yeah, that's, everything I've heard said that.
Yeah.
It's gotta be like 10. What has been accepted so far, is what I've been hearing.
So it has
Yeah.
been accepted in other subbasins.
Right.
In fact, 15 was accepted in one, the King subbasin, Mike, as you know. But, again, it's gonna start to raise some water levels to a value that we can't commit to all the way through the subbasin. It would require us to reduce pumping to a level that would be difficult to achieve.
Amir, how many of those are active wells?
Don't know.
Yeah, I would guess a lot of those are in houses that are, in the 50s or something like that, those old, real shallow wells that no one may be living in them.
So, that was one of the problems with one of the slides today, because the Porterville area has a record of, wells that have been destructed,
Yeah, abandoned, yeah.
abandoned and destructed, and they've been, the correlation is, that's the people who have been hooked up to, the water system in Porterville. Problem is, when they go back to the Oscar base, there's not nearly that many wells that were recorded on the Oscar base. So now state's saying, you have a lot more domestic wells out there, you don't even know they're there. So the Oscar base, basically, where we say there's probably too many wells in the Oscar system, they're saying, no, we think there's a lot more wells out there that even you're not aware of.
You know, Mike, we think that there's more wells than there are in the Oscar database, but we think they're all much deeper.
Yeah.
So we know that the Oscar database misses a ton of wells, and I'm talking about Tulare Lake, for example, because we only did the know that but they're all wells that were drilled at later years, and they're much, much deeper than what is being showed in the Oscar database. We think a lot of these shallow wells that are in the Oscar database no longer exist or no longer operational. And that's the problem, is that when if I come back to you guys and I say, hey, I need $24 million from you, from the growers, your response to me is gonna be, look, these wells don't exist, and so the actual number of wells that are gonna be impacted is a lot less. And, you know, you guys need to do a better job of figuring that out before we go in there and start asking people for $24 million.
Is there any, economic impact models that we're using to, educate the work?
Well, the best one was done by the Blueprint, by Dr. Sunding, and the Water Blueprint, but we haven't done anything specific to basins, so it's not broke out by the Tule and Tulare Lake.
Right.
So we're in these meetings, it's hard to,
But you can extrapolate.
you should be able to,
Yes.
somebody should be able to go in and extrapolate kind of a number. And again, that's where I think the conversation is missing right now, that key component is not in there at all when we're talking to the state staff.
Yeah, I mean, you probably won't have to worry about as many people living out in the country and having domestic wells if there's no jobs out there, so, you know, you might solve your own problem by doing what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You won't have anybody drinking water out there, because there's not gonna be anybody around. Get that full.
Yes.
That's what we want, I mean, that's what we need to avoid. I was gonna say
Yeah.
want, but we really need to avoid that.
And that's the missing part of the conversation, from my perspective.
County of Tulare did a domestic well inventory at one time. I don't know how successful it was. I know it was very difficult to get. And they were, decommissioning wells that were non-operational. Sure, I would be interested, I can reach out to Denise England, she's the one that was over it, and see what they actually came up with. And Self-Help Enterprises, I know, have this database in this area. I mean, the older wells, maybe not, but if you can narrow it down, there's some opportunities.
We were gonna do a well registration database for Tri-County, and, Self-Help was definitely gonna be one of the people we were gonna reach out to help with the domestic well portion of that, typically.
That's, yeah, we were the ones that did, well, they were the ones that,
Yes,
they were the ones that did it for
Yes, whatever they
Tulare
have,
County.
plus whatever methodologies they recommend in order to get to the right people, so, you know, so we can get as many of the, we basically are gonna say you're gonna be eligible if we do, you know, whatever the final well mitigation program looks like, you aren't gonna be eligible unless you participate in a well registration program.
And that may be the key to getting
Yeah,
that, because there was no carrot before,
yeah.
Sounds more like a stick.
well, carrots didn't
I'm not
work
sure the state's gonna let us do that either. I mean, we're gonna try to tie it to that, but
They also made it clear that they don't wanna see any limitations
no
or difficult,
limitations or difficulty for people to
to
apply.
yeah.
Under their program, they create those, though.
We were on mute, so Deanna had to hear me yelling, but I was yelling at the TV that the SAFER program seems to have one set of rules, and they're expecting us to operate under a completely different set of rules. They didn't like the fact that, I think, Tom Harder included some money to do an analysis of why the well failed. And they didn't like the fact that we even included that, because we were gonna evaluate, hey, is it really subsidence issues, or, water level issues, or subsidence, or is it something else? And they didn't even like the fact that,
When you say they don't like that, is that like they're not gonna accept it, or is it they don't like it because they're concerned that it might be abused?
they don't like it because they think it's gonna slow down the process of getting people's, well replaced. And they act like if a well has gone, if there's a problem with a well, that it's automatically gone dry, it's because water levels have dropped, and not because some other issue with the well.
Well, certainly they're there's liability for them for making those assumptions, right? I mean, you can't govern society that way, right? You can't just eliminate all of the common sense that goes along with drilling a well.
Eric, you realize you live in California, right?
Well, I can tell you that, I totally understand it, but here's what we ought to be saying. I mean, we're paying somebody in Sacramento.
I understand, yeah.
Yeah.
And
And these conversations aren't getting through.
Yeah.
Why are we paying?
But I think, yeah, that's a good point, actually. But I think that,
And they're not cheap.
this,
They're super expensive,
right,
no, they're not cheap.
this,
especially if they're not doing anything.
you know, this is just the starting point kind of with this. And it, you know, there's a lot of caution around creating an
Being defensive.
atmosphere, yes, to where there's, you know, but that mindset,
Well, how's that working out?
it's not working out very well. And we're also waiting for state board members. State board members are supposed to come here and meet with the basins, they're making appointments. And state board members have a different attitude than staff, so I think there's each of the GSAs in the basin are trying to balance when to pull the trigger on what action right now, and nobody really knows what that is.
Eric, I would highly recommend that when you find out whatever the state board member is coming, if they do want to meet with,
Yes.
growers and stakeholders,
Mhm.
because, you know, trust me, they'll meet with communities and other people as well, but they definitely want to hear, and we've got to be vocal. The community has to be vocal, the agriculture community has to.
Well, it seems to me that if we're going down a path where the staff is guiding them to a certain understanding, they're gonna come here with those understandings,
Yes,
and it's gonna be completely different.
yes,
That's not a good place to start from.
we agree.
Somebody has to have an impact or, my opinion, somebody needs to tell the state board that their staff is guiding the wrong direction. And it's not just because we don't like it, it's because it's completely ass backwards.
Yeah, it's a false impression of what's actually occurring down here.
That's another way of saying ass backwards.
And that is, it's slow, but that is occurring. It is occurring. The state board members are meeting with people. I can tell you, there is an attorney that was involved in all these meetings, who's no longer involved. I think that she was pulled because she was too aggressive, let's say that. And, there was a lot of complaints.
On which end, on which side of that?
At state board staff level.
Tina?
Yeah, she's pulled. She's not working.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So state board members are listening to us, but, you know, that's just kind of a slow process too. Anyway, sorry, Sebastian.
Who was pulled? Was that Tina Canna-Leahy?
Yes, that was what I had heard. That's a rumor, sorry. But the last two meetings that I've been involved with, she was not there, and she had been in all of them up to that point.
and
Interesting.
very prominently vocal and,
Oh,
yeah.
that's a polite way to say it, Mayor.
What's that gal's name?
Tina Leahy.
Tina what?
Leahy.
Like,
I think she still goes by Cannon.
Tina Cannon Leahy.
Oh, does she?
Married to Brian.
Did anyone else on the call have, any questions? I know we're kind of talking here in the room, but I wanna, Jeff, I saw you took yourself off of, or you turned on your camera there. I just wanna make sure if anyone else had any questions.
Yeah, I do have a comment about, you know, one of the things that you're gonna have to do with your mitigation plan is do outreach. And to the extent that you're successful in outreach, you're gonna create the impression in the public's mind that if their well goes dry, the first call they need to make is to you. And we know that there's a lot of problems with wells quite apart from water levels. You know, they get old, stuff happens. And you're gonna get put into a position, I don't think this is avoidable, where you're gonna have to treat every application, every contact that you have with the public on a well, you have to treat it with respect. And you're gonna have to provide them an interim supply, you know, get bottled water out there in the next, 24 hours. And you're gonna have to spend some level of staff time investigating it. And that is not cheap. It's just not. I mean, but a good chunk of those are not gonna be your fault. And to expect the GSA to pay for that and the landowners to pay for that when it's not their fault is not fair. So I brought this up to the CAP, Safe Drinking Water Group, that I actually co-chair with Jennifer Clary from Clean Water Action. And Jennifer, to her credit, jumped on it right away and acknowledged that the GSA shouldn't have to absorb that cost for wells that they're not responsible for. And she suggested, and actually did follow through, that the CV salts, the management areas for CV salts, which in your area is a Thule, forget the name of it, Kauai's got the Water Foundation. You've got cooperative agreements with the state board where when you do water testing for elements beyond nitrates, they're responsible for the farmers, the CV salts are responsible for nitrate, but not these other water quality constituents. The state pays for that testing. And she said that's the model. And she strongly encouraged the GSAs on these mitigation programs to initiate a conversation with the state board about getting funding to assist with your mitigation program for responding to requests for service from members of the public where you are not, where it is. The only thing you're liable for is when the failure of that well is due to a decision that you made to allow water levels to drop. Then you're liable. But for the rest of them, I think the case you got to make to the state is the state passed the human right to water as a public obligation, and these people don't have water, and it's not the GSA's fault. So the state has an obligation to help finance that. So I think, given Jennifer Clary's suggesting of it and the other members of that committee that were on there from Community Water Center and Self-Help, they didn't push back at all. I think there's a door opening there. As for safer funds being used to pay for mitigation that genuinely is the GSA's responsibility, I think they're going to resist that very, very strongly. So.
Yeah, I agree, Jeff. But thank you. That's an excellent suggestion. It's an excellent point. I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you. Yeah, so we definitely need to follow up on that, and I might reach out to you offline and have some more discussions about this as well, because I think that's a great thing for us to figure out how to incorporate it into the plan. Okay. That was our wonderful call for the Thule Subbasin. That will start these meetings kind of a downer when you start on that. Clear Lake, we've had a couple meetings with them, or a couple recent meetings with them, I should say. I think we're on to meeting 6 now. And we've talked about subsidence as well and water levels. And it's an ongoing issue. One of the things that Clear Lake is probably a little bit ahead of Thule for change is that on the subsidence coming up here next week, internally we're going to be having some conversations about how to modify some of the pumping allocations below the clay to meet the pumping requirements to reduce the rate of subsidence. Those will be probably very different than ultimately where Thule might end up. So I don't, just because you hear some number at Clear Lake, don't assume that's going to be the same for Thule. Thule Trust. Susan, we're looking at you.
Yeah. So we held our first Ag Advisory Committee meeting on the 19th. We had about 20 participants, good representation throughout the basin. Really, it was kind of a meet and greet and kind of informing of what's to come. and just get an idea of what really people's concerns were. There were three main that stuck out. Subsidence was definitely one of them. The other was, really, what does the future look like? They're just, that concern. And then the third was for those that are generational farmers, how can they ensure that that's, they're gonna be able to continue to do that? So, obviously I don't have the answers, but hopefully we can find some programs that can help to, make that happening. The land fallowing program, we did extend the date, to October the 2nd. I currently have 8 applications. I believe 2 of those, I was working on that before I came here today, so I think 2 of those are potentially in Tri-County. I know one is for sure, there's one I'm not quite positive.
I think you have two.
Yeah, I think so too.
Let me ask you just quickly, the advisory committee, when you met with, or what are we calling it? The
Ag Advisory Committee?
Ag Advisory Committee. Subsidence concern. What was the actual concern? The amount of subsidence, or the fact that subsidence is going to limit what they do?
Yeah, it was, what now are they gonna be required or not be able to do because of subsidence?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's, all right. So, Susan, how do you see these relating back to the MLRP program?
Well,
Is it, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, ask me your question.
Is it more on the land fouling type program? That, because, one of your questions was, or one of their concerns was, what does the future look like?
Mhm. So, one thing you have to make very clear to this group is this is a voluntary program. It's not mandatory.
Right.
And that we're looking for their input on potential types of projects, programs that will aid us in all gaining that sustainability. And that could look different depending on where you are. One of the things that I, am really trying to get someone to develop for me is, mapping system that overlays, various opportunities, really, is what it boils down to. So where, we have transmission lines, so where solar might be an option versus, we have already conservation areas that may be adjacent. Not that everyone's going to go that direction, but that people have options and they can see where they're located and how that option may be good for them or not good for them, just depending on their situation. And I'm sure, there's things that they may think of that I haven't, but we're, trying different, farming techniques. Is one of the things that we've talked about. We've talked about, fallowing is one way of doing it, sinking basins. So creating sinking basins so that helps things, where we might not have had those before. I'm thinking, Kathy, my brain person.
Well, I think one of the constraints is MLRP is funded through the Department of Conservation.
Mhm.
And so there's constraints if you use DOC funds to put in a recharge basin or a sinking basin. As you're aware of that too. So we're being very careful with that sort of thing. I think I have a source for the mapping you're talking about.
I'm hoping that I got it taken care of.
Okay, I met yesterday with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, with their area manager, and she's wanting to meet with you.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there's some opportunities, they want to talk about this idea of MRP and where some of these lands would be, and they might have some maps that we could utilize, but,
Right. The MLRP, I think one thing that getting a little bit hung up, and maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this, although there is money in this fund to do projects, the main objective, I think, here is let's develop plans to identify the types of projects and prioritize and identify potential locations. Then we can go after funds from other sources to help support that
Yeah,
going
yeah,
forward.
that's right.
Yeah, and that, because I know that actually came up, we had a MLRP grantee meeting on Monday, and there was kind of that topic, and that was really driven home. On the mapping side, a couple of other things I was thinking is, somewhat of soil type and, not connected today.
There's a lot of work that's been done with something called the Green Print that was done years ago.
Yes.
UC Davis did a lot of work down here. There was another, I don't think it was TNC, but there's a lot of,
all those.
there's a lot of mapping that's come on, and so hate to have to go and
Yeah, they
reinvent.
exist. I believe they all exist, because I have found pieces of them here and there. The issue is I would like to bring those layers together and have one map so we can overlay them and see, have that view. So I did bring that up to the key staff with MLRP, and they were very, excited about that idea, and thought they may have access to do it as well, so.
At the department. I think UC Davis did a lot of work, and I think we should look to them.
Yes. So that's, it's really unknown, it's in the making, right?
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
that's the kind of message, at least, that I'm trying to put out, is that, I know we don't all have the answers, we don't all can't see the future, we're not gonna be able to tell them what the future looks like, but what we can do is try to decide, well, if we did this, now where would be the best place to do that? Because it won't, can't seek water there, place to, open place there, or, there's no transmission line, so you can't do solar in that area, whatever that may be.
What's the meeting schedule and the output that comes out from the meetings? Is that going directly to the core plan or the individual plans?
So the meetings, the minutes are, notes are taken and they're put into, general kind of, and those are used, they should be going out to the GSA
Okay.
for the local plans and for the core plan, as being used for the core plan as well. We will be meeting, the Ag Advisory Committee will be meeting quarterly. We do have, I know there's a couple of workshops that are planned that are more, they're open workshops, they're not just for the committee members. So there will be one for DAX and there'll be one for agriculture. Kind of present MLRP on a broader scale to the community, and get feedback and concerns and those types of things. Core plans and local plans, drafts are at different stages with everyone. One of the things that I'm really trying to do is meet with those that are working on their plans, and I want to be involved in that. I want to know I don't want to go talk to this group and tell them something that I'm going to later have to go hide for,
Sure.
And I want to make sure, and at the same time, that I'm able to provide that feedback to you all as well. So it's helpful for me to see, what is your line of thinking versus where is their line of thinking? So that when we come together to put that final piece together, we're not fully on different pages.
Because they're looking at I looked at that roadmap while we were in the Education and Outreach Committee, and they're looking at having the draft local plans reviewed at the second open session workshop, which is gonna be in May. So I think that's why I think they wanna have the meeting with you all next week, to look at where you're going with the local plans. And that would be great. I would suggest that Susan, since she's offering to help, that she attend, that works, that internal meeting on the local plans. I think that'd be a good idea.
And I've been keeping that in front of, Robert and Malaya, which are doing a lot of the groundwork on the outreach and whatnot, insisting that what we're doing is not a checkbox.
Right.
That it is, what we are doing is going to be incorporated. If it's just a checkbox, then I might as well walk away now. Because, I'm not gonna lose my credibility over it. And so I'm really pushing hard on that side to ensure that that's not the case.
Good. We agree. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
All right, we're gonna jump into the real reason why most of us are here today, which is the proposed, recharge policy. So, a couple of board meetings ago, the board asked Deanna and I to put together a formal recharge policy for Tri-County. We had that emergency policy that was in place. We all knew that that was temporary. We all knew that that was for 1 year. It was clearly written that way. We also knew that it had some shortcomings. It had some areas that needed to be addressed, and we thought, hey, we need to put together something more formal and incorporate it into, and have an official policy. So Deanna called me and asked me to put together, and I did what every consultant in the world does. It's like, hey, I wonder what else everyone else is doing around me. And there's no point in reinventing the wheel, I'll be very honest with you guys, and there's no point in having our policy be drastically different than our neighbors either. It has to make sense for our area, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I reached out to Eric Lemus. I looked at what Lower Tule and Pixley had done. I looked at both their document, their initial document, which was, I think, back in 19 or 20, I don't remember the exact date, and what their current policy is. And then I looked at what I thought were maybe some of the challenges in our emergency policy. I thought about, hey, how do we incorporate this in a way that our landowners can use? So, so we have a draft policy, a very much. Eric, do you have a copy? There's some more copy. Or is it on the back of your sheet? It might be. There you go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so,
I already went through it.
So,
We've been through this already, right?
no,
Well,
sort of, but
A version.
a version of it. That was the emergency policy, and now we're into the, what's gonna be our official long-term policy. So this is intended to replace the emergency policy. So background, and I almost probably should have called it like a mission statement, if you will, but first and foremost is the GSA wants to encourage any type of recharge that's going to reduce groundwater pumping, period. So we want to encourage that. So keeping that as our mission statement is like, hey, how do we reduce groundwater pumping and write this in a way that's easy, makes sense, and that it's incentivized, that people have enough of incentive to say, okay, it's worth it for me to do this kind of recharge. So that was key. So we then said, okay, we already have an accounting system, our Faith and Safe. We already have a bucket in there, literally for owner-derived credits. Am I getting that right? Is that the owner credit?
Landowner developed credit.
Owner-developed credits,
Yep.
yeah. So we already have a bucket in there. So that means all your accounts have that. And so we were looking at that and saying, okay, and by the way, it goes, I think the use of the water is.
I looked at that today, and we're probably gonna have to make some changes, because I have the operation of use is sustainable yield, and then it goes down to landowner credits, and then goes into the tier. I think when we're talking in these, with these terms, really that landowner developed credit needs to go up above the sustainable sustainable yield and
Yeah.
always be used. Of course, for one thing, it's less expensive, but for another thing, you know, as long as you can maintain your sustainable yield in your account, you're gonna wanna do that, so. That order of use probably needs to be switched around. Draw up this policy, you know, a couple of years before you ever have one year, and then you
Never
rethink
do.
about,
Yeah.
the order of operation.
Just off the cuff, I mean, what's the difference between a credit that, say the owner developed credit versus one that the GSA arbitrarily puts there as a, what do you call it,
Sure.
Yeah.
So currently landowners have their sustainable yield,
sustainable?
which is a calculated number, between the subbasins.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say arbitrary, I meant kind of arbitrary.
And then the tier one allocation was an allocation that was given to, all irrigated lands that were in production in 2018. And that was a number that this advisory committee talked over for some time to get us on a pace where we would be sustainable in 20 years. So that you didn't have a place where you went and just fell off a cliff. We started at the end and worked back to a number that we thought was workable and livable, and we put that in place. So those are the two, and in between those two, in the order of operation, I layered in landowner credit with the idea that, you know, if ever a landowner developed credit through recharge or a project of some sort, that number would go there. But, and in most cases, at the end of 5 years here, it doesn't matter a whole lot. Most people have used their sustainable yield that are gonna have some sort of recharge. So it's not, critical right now, I'll say. But as we move forward and we get another bucket of sustainable yield in 2026, then that operation of order will make a difference. So I'm just rethinking that as far as the policy.
That's an important one, because some things can be traded and some things can't,
Yeah.
something, you know, so there are some, and the cost, it also varies, so when you go into penalties and all those types of things, so we wanna make sure that we revisit everything, right? So all of that is open for discussion. And again, this policy is intended to be a straw man, and I'll be honest, even Deanna and I don't see eye to eye on every part of it, so feel free to,
And these are just, you know, bullet points of what'll be in there. There's, of course, gonna be legal language, there's gonna be language around, you know, what constitutes a basin, that type of thing. So there's additions that's gonna be added to this, but these are the basic points of the recharge policy.
Quick question, can a federal agency participate if they meter and they do some kind of a recharge basin? Could they participate in this program and then transfer the credits to a wetland reserve easement within Tri-County?
Yes,
Yeah.
because if we're talking about the Bureau of Land Management, they have an account, which I created an account for them, and their credits are sitting in there.
Yeah, I guess he's a water rights person with USGS has reached out, and I'd like him to come and talk to you guys, before they really start. They're now starting exploring, why haven't we participated? And I said, well, BLM is. And they go, yeah, they're the only agency that is. So they're very curious, and so we discussed it last week, and I said, I believe, you know, we have some WRE wetlands right down the street that are part of, Angiola, that area owned by Angiola, and you could transfer, and then you could flood up, you know, those wetlands, which again, they might be some recharge, but probably not, because they're pretty much clay. That was just something they asked me,
Yeah.
so that's,
They have an account, and we be treated like any other landowner in that account, and trading within Tri-County is permissible, so.
Tell me number 6.
whoa, hold on, Mike, hold on. Let me walk you through all of them, okay? So let me walk you guys through and then point out specifically some areas where I'd like to get a lot more feedback from this group. Everybody just jumps, everybody just jumps to the, okay, so, surface water purchased, and maybe the word purchase there might not be the right term, but, any surface water is applied in a specific groundwater recharge basin. So, I looked at essentially what Pixley had said, and said they want everything that has to go to a specific groundwater recharge basin. And that means, as Deanna has already pointed out, we need to kind of define what we mean by a recharge basin. That's where I'm open to having a definition there that would work for the GSA, meaning that we need to be comfortable from the GSA standpoint, because we've got to make sure that things are defensible, if you will. We want to make sure that there's some data provided to us that talks about, that gives us at least the size of the basin, the location of the basin, and some kind of evaluation that was done on what kind of recharge you're actually going to get in that basin. And that was one of the challenges in the emergency policy was, if people are just coming in and giving us a gut feel, and I'm giving them credit, and I'm not giving credit to, I'm going to pick on Doug because he's sitting across from me. That's where things got, a little bit too subjective. And we wanted to make it so that there has to be some kind of evaluation done that by the landowner that be able to tell us, hey, this is my basin, here's where it's located, here's how big it is, and here's how much it's going to recharge, and here's the supporting documentation for that. So then we go, okay, we've got that, we've got it on record, and whatever water they apply to that basin, we can say, yeah, that was actually recharged, and we feel comfortable giving you credits that have real financial impacts. The language, it continues on, the language, then says,
Can I,
yeah.
So you mentioned that you went to Pixley and you went to, Lower Tule to get this kind of framework that you're talking about. Were you also using their defining factors for?
So Eric didn't send me that. That is, as I was writing this, I realized I didn't have that from Eric, so I was going to clarify from Eric exactly what Pixley and Lower Tule used to find that dedicated recharge basin.
Yeah, not that we have to use what they have, but.
Right, but it's a starting point, yeah, I agree.
And Mayor, I think you ought to just take the word purchased out, because who
Yeah.
cares whether it's
Yeah,
purchased,
right.
leased, exchanged, or whatever.
However you get it, right?
However you get it.
Right,
And I can see these next bullet points if you're just gonna talk about a recharge basin, but, we're also gonna talk about over irrigation on farm grounds and fallow lands and that kind of thing.
Yep. So just staying with the recharge basin, we then basically said, hey, look, you have to tell us what it is. And I included this language about it's isolated from the landowner's irrigation system. That was some language I took directly from Pixley, and I went back and forth on it. Sorry, I keep looking at these two because they're the growers. I went back and forth on that a little bit, and I was trying to think to myself, is that necessary? What's the pros and cons of including that? And it's one thing to say, hey, I put water in this basin, and and it's there for recharge. It's another thing to say, I put water in this basin, half of it recharged and half of it was used for my irrigation supply. I don't have any way of measuring that. I don't have any way of knowing what happened and how that water was used, right?
So, I don't know if you got that far with Lower Tule, but my understanding of their situation is if it is a dedicated recharge basin, then there is no outlet.
Yeah, there's no outlet, yeah.
So that's part of the rule that they have.
Right, and I included that in ours, the isolated from the irrigation system, but I didn't know if I should include it in ours. That was again, one of those points where it's very much open to discussion and hearing some feedback from this group. more
Yeah.
difficult, yeah.
It is, but I think, or pick on when we have flood releases or whatever, and somebody wants to stick water in there, both to sink and also to regulate the water, but those flood releases go off, and then all of a sudden there's demand. It'd be better to use that to feed the demand than pumping groundwater to feed that demand, so.
But it goes to what you're calling that. They just have a different designation for that, that would require, you know, maybe some credits be left behind to cover the cost of management. Meaning, like, you wouldn't have to have as much management for a dedicated basin. Right? You're gonna have more management, and you're gonna have to cover those costs, you're gonna have to have WIT do that.
Couldn't you deal with it just by saying that, for recharge basins that are connected to an irrigation system, that any outlets would have to be metered, so at least then you could see how much is taken out?
Do recharge basins though actually get connected and used in that way? Because you wouldn't want to run your system through a recharge basin where it's sinking to the ground if you're utilizing it for your.
You're talking about two different things.
Yeah,
basically.
that's what I'm thinking.
It's just, pick this flood event. Let's say we build a big facility, and we may just let the water sit there and recharge, but if it's big enough, you might wanna take water out, you know, when the flood releases are off. I don't know whether you just deal with that on some independent basis, you know, and treat that separate, because I think you're right.
Call it recharge storage or something like that, but you're just gonna have some way to administer.
Yeah, Mike, I like your idea that if you're gonna take, any outlet has to be metered, and that way we're all comfortable that, you know, if you put in, I'm gonna make the number, 100 acre feet, and you took out 50, we know that. And we can just say, okay, we'll give you groundwater recharge credit
For half of it, yeah.
for half of it, right?
And Lower Tully's requirement on the inlet side has to be.
Yeah, it has to be metered on the inlet
Yeah.
side, yeah. So good. We do need to define exactly what we're gonna accept as a basin, and then I'll change the language about the outlets, you know, to be metered as well.
I don't know whether that'll ever happen, but I was thinking it might.
If it gives people more flexibility, and that's what we want. We want as much flexibility as we can provide. Number 2 basically says, hey, the cost of establishing and running these basins is the sole expense of the landowner. All surface water diverted to the landowner is required to be metered, so anything you're putting in your basin needs to be metered. And then, once you're in your meter, that surface water will give you 90% credit of the water diverted, and then the remaining 10% credit, would be the leave behind.
And see, that's where it gets sticky with that. If it's a recharge basin, then 90% credit to the book makes sense. If it's just going in and then going out to be used, in essence,
Well, that's
and
where
with
you
the
have to
lender
subtract that
queue and
out,
how we
yeah.
calculate that, that would be double dipping, so to speak, so.
So 90% is it's a pretty good
Very
incentive.
good number.
Yeah.
It's a good incentive for everyone to say, hey, I'm gonna seriously consider this if I'm gonna get,
Basin, yeah.
if you're gonna get that kind with minimal leave behind. I'm looking at you guys, sorry, I keep looking at you too.
No, I think that's kind of the running thing right now.
Right.
I don't know where they came up with it, but I mean, what we would call it in farming is shrink.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain amount of, like, if I take my almonds and I sell 100% of, they give me 100% of the proceeds that came from that, and they realized in 50 years that they couldn't cover that because it's shrink. Now all of a sudden they have to get money back from you. So the shrink is basically gives you a little bit of cover for the amount of water that you're assuming is going into the ground.
Right.
And as we go forward too, with hearing the state board on managing the different ABC aquifers, I assume it'll be credited to the upper aquifer, so that's where your credits will be.
I actually have that as a note to myself,
Okay.
is that is a sticking point that I haven't comfortably figured out, and I've talked to, wanna make sure, right now, the accounting system for Tri-County essentially gives you a pumping allocation
And grows.
in gross, right? And at some point in the future, we're gonna have to probably go, okay, above and below, and your credits may apply to one or the other, depending on what you're doing. But yeah, that's been a real sticking point in my mind, because I'm trying to encourage, but I don't wanna give people credit for something that's not actually impacting and helping.
Well, I'm just, because listening all the dialogue with the state board,
Yeah.
when subsidence is the
Yeah.
real big issue,
Yeah,
you know, you give somebody, they put in 100 acre feet and they
Yeah.
take 90 out down
below the
deep.
clay,
And so
Yeah.
that, we're not,
not helping the
we're
situation.
just creating a bigger problem.
Right, that is my concern, and I actually had that as one of the things I wanna talk about was, at some point, we're gonna have to modify this policy, specifically address the fact that there's, the above and below clay pumping, and in which zone you're gonna get credit for.
Yeah, we can get a trading platform where landowners can trade deep for shallow and all that, but, we got a ways to go.
Yeah. Okay, so I basically said the next thing, the item 5 was that the groundwater credits can be can be carried over to subsequent years. This is one area where Deanna and I disagree. I said the credits would expire after the 5 years. Deanna says, no, let's keep those credits. Once you put water in the ground, if you have, and this will change a little bit because, or may not be relevant, because if that's the first water you use,
Right.
then, 5 years may be a moot point. But my thinking was, and this is the argument that I always have with, Elena Erlenmart, was, hey, you put water in the ground, it's moving too, right? It's moving, and, if you haven't used it in 5 years, by the way, I'm not saying it's a straight line reduction, I'm just saying, you got 100 acre feet, you didn't pump it out, 5 years later, am I still giving you 100 acre feet? And my feeling on that was, I would like to, maybe it's not 5 years, maybe it's some other number, but I'd like to have a cutoff where it's like, you don't use that credit, it's gone. And Deanna feels like that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that doesn't necessarily incentivize everybody the way we want to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. But I also agree with your terminal, or your understanding of how the water's moving underground. But I have to say, if you, let's say the value of those credits is doing this, right? So everybody's incentivized to sink water. Because over time, that water is gonna be more valuable. And so they're not gonna wanna pump it in that 5 years. And therefore, you're gonna look like a superhero as water levels go up, right?
But Eric, I can tell you, we had a lot of discussion like at Laguna, because Laguna looked at Kern County, you're in a bathtub, so it's not moving. Laguna, the water is moving. And so what they did, right or wrong, they had a 5-year sunset. But if you got into a wet year, then you'd have an extra year. It would just take what you have and extend it. So, because the wells are gonna be off.
Yeah.
And one of the things you can game, Eric, is your credits would be the first pumping that you use. So if you got the credits you'd use those that year, and the credits you're earning that year are allocated to you, then you would bank those, and so, you're kinda
Use it as you go.
yeah.
Which makes sense, but my point being is, like, the incentive process needs to be probably pretty high on the list.
My personal thing is, I don't see it as a problem right now, and I think it should be evaluated later on. I think it should be open-ended right now, and later on, if this becomes an issue where we have actually that much credit coming onto the books, which is not likely really, I mean, I don't see it becoming an issue. The only way it's gonna become an issue is if somebody's able to really purchase a lot of water and throw a whole bunch in the ground over a long period of time. that's not something that's occurring right now, but it's completely up to the landowners and the board. It doesn't, we can manage it either way, it's just,
I mean,
from my perspective, it's not,
I agree with
it's like
you.
making an issue that's not an issue yet.
It's probably gonna be more of a factor of where you're saying it versus where you're pulling it out.
Yes.
Right, that's gonna be a bigger deal than.
And I'm thinking of like carryover when you've got a reservoir and you've got more flood water coming into the reservoir. You gotta move that water out. You've got groundwater, you don't necessarily need to move it out. There's not a compelling reason to have a 5-year.
Another thing to think about is really groundwater levels, and particularly under the clay, these restrictions are going to start hitting. And if the landowner did have a landowner developed credit, and now is restricted from pumping, at least they have something that they can trade or sell. And if they have that on the account.
And you gotta think about how the banks are gonna look at this, right? Because, you know, ag lending is gonna require multiple source irrigation, and that's gonna go into groundwater credit. Has to.
What if I built a bank? I'm not farming. Man, I built a bank, put water on the ground. How do I wanna treat that? I get credits, and then I can just sell those credits, right? Am I still helping the area? And I guess the argument you guys would say is, yeah, and that there's no reason to put the 5-year limitation, right?
You're still, you know, the incentive is the important part, right? So you wanna incentivize as much as possible thinking, and in order to do that, you have to have a market. Because, I mean, we make these decisions every day, trying to figure out how much money can I spend to develop this location.
Right.
And it's a question of what is the value of those credits gonna be in the future?
Yeah.
And it's a lot of speculation involved in that. I mean, you have to worry about whether or not you're gonna have another wet year. You're gonna have to worry about whether or not somebody changes the rules down the road.
Yeah.
That never happens here, right?
It never happens.
Right? We talk about that.
Yeah, no one's ever changed any rules anywhere in Sigmund.
Right, so there's risk, right? But the point being is, you know, by putting limitations on timing, to me, I think that is a limitation that you really, it's going to be a factor.
Mike, different opinion or different thoughts?
No, I mean, I've just seen it in different areas. I mean,
Yeah.
one thing I can see here is we're kinda at the end of the pike anyway, so I don't know how far the water's really gonna move, so I don't know whether 5 years makes any sense. You know, you look at Laguna and some of the other, the water's moving, you know, to the northwest, so, here, I don't think the water really moves once we get down to Tulare Lake. It's a dam at that point.
I mean, the way it looks to me is like, if you have a system that where you're able to hold those for longer periods of time, then you're gonna have people that have to really think long and hard about where they're selling those credits, right? And so, people who are buying ground and putting permanent crops in, they're gonna have to view that as a long-term investment, not just from the standpoint of how long it takes to get revenue from it, but how long they're gonna be able to sustain it with the water. So, they gotta be able to look at those and like, well, this is 5 years, I mean, you know, it just adds so many question marks.
Yeah.
The guys that can fallow their land around a small ranch and they can sustain themselves and they can sell credits and not farm their land, and isn't that the model that we're going for anyways?
I'm not sure we're going for it, but it's probably where we're gonna end up.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's not, I mean, I guess
It's an
somebody's going
option.
for it.
Yeah,
Let's say that.
yeah,
It's an option.
it's likely it's the reality of what's gonna happen. So I'm gonna take that out. And by the way, just so you guys all know, Lower Tule has it in perpetuity, so that once you get those credits, they're yours forever until you use them or sell them or whatever.
Oh, I thought there was a 5 year deal on that one.
Not anymore. On the current policy in Lower Tule, it's not there. It actually, so,
Okay.
like I said, I went back and forth on this one.
Do we see it affecting our sustainable yield or something
Right.
there by, you know, because the water's moving out or something,
Right.
that just take them out?
Take it out. All right, we said that the groundwater recharge credits, so these are the actual recharge credits transferred to other landowners within the Tri-County. And, you know, as long as you meet all the other requirements that we have for the transfer. So you can transfer, which sell, whatever, you know, whatever word you wanna use. So we would allow the recharge credits to be, I don't think we're really that big enough to worry about pumping in one area versus pumping in another area. You know, we do have a little concern about pumping below the clay and all that issue, but again, when we're ready to deal with that, we'll deal with that.
I do think, though, that we need to have flexibility, so like if we go to one of our neighbors, we create a sinking basin upstream, upslope, they're gonna want some leave behind, but I would think that there needs to be flexibility between the different GSAs, because that could, if we lock the borders where we can only trade a credit in ours,
Yeah.
they could do the same thing, and then we get locked out. I mean, if I can see if somebody wants to come in our backyard and bank and they leave some water behind to benefit everyone, why not let them take it back out somewhere?
Eventually that'll happen, but it's probably gonna be down the road after everybody gets done fighting.
Cause I think, Eric, candidly, the more recharge is gonna be to the east of us. We don't have much,
East and north, yeah,
Yeah.
you're right.
so if they start putting up bars because we don't have flexibility, cause I would hope we would be at the table encouraging as much flexibility to let us bank in their backyard. And they benefit, they ought to encourage that if we have a leave behind for them.
I'll look at what the other leave behinds are for transfer. And for example, I know Eastern Tules is higher than some others. I think it's almost 30%. Does that sound right? It's up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. I'll rewrite this so that you can transfer within the Tule subbasin, but there'll be a leave behind of X
If
amount.
you go outside our,
Yeah,
you go
outside of
ours,
you
you
go
get a
out,
leave
yeah.
behind.
Yeah, no leave behind if you stay within Tri-County.
Right.
If you go outside of Tri-County to the other GSAs within the subbasin, then there'll be X% leave behind. Yeah, it's pretty hefty in Eastern Tule, if I remember. Okay. Number 6, which is where Mike wanted to go to, and I think 6 in the next sentence, or the next paragraph below it probably contradict each other a little bit, and
That's what I was gonna point out.
and I probably need to just, take out 6. And say, okay, so then we got to, okay, now a recharge on open ground, it's not a designated recharge basin. And let's say the landowner doesn't have any real data for us, other than, hey, I put it on this property over here. We still wanna encourage Floodmar, we still want you to encourage people using their fields, whatever, but we're gonna give you a lot less credit, because we have to feel comfortable that whatever number we're giving you is actually what's happening, right? Have to be able, because I need to be able to tell Eric, hey, you know, person X is getting this much credit, and you gotta feel comfortable that the system works, right? That whatever you're being held to is the same, you know, because you spent a lot of money building a basin and hiring, you know, somebody to go out and do some test holes and everything else.
And this other guy's just over irrigating his corn, so he
Yeah.
gets credit.
Right.
Well, there's intended for people not to over irrigate their corn. I can tell you that. I mean, if you wanna be a crappy farmer, there's plenty of those around, but you can't grow as much corn by over irrigating it. And so you're gonna have a financial hit right off the bat if you try to do that. So, you know, if you guys think that the satellite stuff that you're using, what is it called,
Land IQ.
Land IQ is accurate, and I'm sure there's plenty of opinions out there. But let's say it was 100% accurate. Well, then you should be okay to establish, you know, over irrigation for trees and stuff like that. I mean, you can easily move your drip hose into the middle of your rows, or you can start flooding ground that is not normally flooded. And you're actually putting on a crop, and so if you're accurate on how much you're taking off, and form of ET, then you should be, I mean, you wanna incentivize that.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of that ground in.
That's kind of already, that's built into the system, because all we're asking for is, now we're talking about surface water that you're applying to your crops.
Right.
And Tri-County's policy is that you report that surface water to Tri-County, and that diversion of surface water, and that's added to the book. So that's already there. I think this is more just in the area of the flooding that was kind of uncontrollable, or
But if you're just putting it on the ground.
fallow, this is more fallow
Okay.
ground.
Yeah.
But for your farmland, that surface water, gets reported to Tri-County, and then that goes right onto the account and offsets whatever ET calculated, consumed.
So in the land fallowing program, there is an option that you can sink water, shallow, so you don't drown your crop, but, due to cover. And there's no ET hit, not technically irrigated land.
Right.
How would that work with this, credit? If they signed up to do that, and so it's only if water's available, obviously, so there's no guarantee, but, possibly, we had a few last year, that sank quite a bit of water, actually.
If you know the size of the basin, you have to assume, you don't have to assume it, but just let's assume it's 100% covered by water. You just take the amount of water delivered, and you take an EVAP number for every day that it's covered with water. That way, you know what's EVAPing every day off that ground. That's what it's just credit.
Trying to think of that with our current system, like.
We could.
It's a difference, because, I mean, I think Wetlands takes an EVAP number off all their basins.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else is really doing that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think a lot of people are.
Right.
I know Westlands is, you're right. That we don't wanna be responsible for calculating your recharge value.
Yeah.
We wanna be able to prove your basin and say, yes, it does this, I'm gonna make the number, it does half an acre foot a day or whatever, right? And you're gonna come back to me and you're gonna say, hey, we got a meter value, we put this much, and we go, okay, great. We don't wanna have to do a lot of calculations on our end, because then we end up in this situation where you just end up in a fight with a landowner, and that's what we're trying to avoid, right? So, we can, I can put some language in here that says, we'll give you 50% credit, or, I don't know what's the right way to say this, but, if you provide additional information, that value can be raised.
But aren't you gonna take evaporation off of your recharge basins too?
We weren't planning on it.
No.
No, we were planning on just letting you meter it, we were gonna be super generous, right?
But is that gonna
Is that defensible, like your original?
I mean, because they have evaporation numbers, I mean.
Yeah.
EVAP's, I mean, I can
we
tell you
know
from a lake
drainage,
standpoint,
yeah,
the EVAP's a big number.
It's a big number.
it's the inch a day, isn't it, or,
No, I'd say a third to maybe a half, but
I can't remember what the drainage.
So-
it depends on the time of year.
Yeah.
So two different things from my perspective. One is we have the dedicated recharge basins, and those are gonna have some paperwork and show some percolation numbers, right? So those did not have as much that problem as, with percolation, particularly, because most of that's gonna be during the winter time. And then Susan's point, those fallow lands, the way this is written here, would be eligible for 50% of what goes on to their
Yeah.
property.
Right.
So 50% of that credit.
So let me ask you though, you got two side by side, you got a basin on one and you got pretty much the same sand profile on the one.
Yeah.
And so a guy just puts a 3-foot berm around it and floods it out. Why would that be any different than, why would he only get 50% when he's, as much as going down there as probably is going down to the.
Yeah, I agree, Mike, I agree, and we would, you'd come back to us and we'd say, you know, we'll add some language to this. And we'd say, yeah, you're right, your basin is right here, we know exactly what your basin does, you've given us that data, and you just built this temporary, berm around this area, you flooded it, we'll give you the same credit.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I mean,
from a structural standpoint, if I put a cup of water on this table, because it's super flat, it's gonna spread out, and the more surface area is, the more evap you're gonna have.
Exactly,
Right.
yes.
That's gonna come into the equation.
Yeah.
If I'm piling it 3 feet deep, there's gonna be a lot less of that water evaporating as a percentage. So somehow we need to get that figured out. Like if you've got, like when you have, when you qualified you must have a certain depth to it, because if you're just spreading water real thin,
yeah, but that's what I was
Well, that's
gonna
why
say.
I was asking about taking evaporation off it,
Yeah.
and then it levelizes it.
That's what I was gonna say, but with Mike's point, that's why you have a dedicated recharge basin that meets all the parameters that aren't here. That's why you're giving them 90%, because they've gone through that process. You know, they might have had to go down 2 feet to get that percolation or whatever happened. That's a dedicated recharge basin. That's very different than just flooding up an area.
Yeah, but still, Deanna, somebody can get 3 inches a day versus one that gets a foot, you still, whatever it is, it is. And I think, you know, like when we get wet years, landowners should be encouraged to go out there and just sink it. Well, they may not get as perforate like a true evaporate, but they ought to get credit, you know, for what they're putting in the ground. I don't see why you would discount them if they can document how much is metered going in, less the evaporation. I mean, it's not as efficient as a basin, but, you know, at least I don't see why they'd only get 50% of what really goes down in the ground.
Like, you're not, I guess my concern is that you're not incentivizing anyone to build basins then. You're gonna get the same amount of credit without having to do
The
anything.
only difference is it's not cheap to dig down and build a basin.
No, it's not. It's
And
not.
it may be a lot cheaper just to put a 3-foot berm and graze it in other years, and then when you
Yeah.
get a wet year, you flood the same.
you're gonna have a combination of both.
Yeah.
Right, so that combination is gonna be important for big water years. The basins themselves are gonna be important for good water years, for ones you're gonna have surface water.
Right.
Those big areas that you need to spread water fast need to be encouraged for maybe not flooding people. That's important too. I know that's not one of the goals that we're talking about, but it is important. And people try to do it, and we should encourage it, in my opinion, especially in our area. I mean, you got a lot of people that are subject to that flooding.
Yeah.
And we can go back and say, hey, we've encouraged this by doing this.
Unless you got high-speed rail paying you to take dirt out,
It's very
it's
expensive.
doggone expensive to build them. That's why
Yeah.
people are doing those injection wells, looking at that now.
Yeah, it's expensive, and you gotta put the dirt somewhere that you haul
Yeah.
out, and moving dirt is expensive, as you guys well know. Well, let me come up with a, definition of what we mean by the basin. As Eric pointed out, we'll talk to Pixley, kind of figure out what they're using as their definition. And then let's add a second section, or third section, if you will, that specifically talks about flood events. How we would handle flood events and what kind of credits we come up with for flood events. And then, the other thing I wrote down here is how are we gonna handle evaporative losses? And what's the best way to build that into the analysis? It's certainly from a flood event standpoint, I think it's more relevant because, you know, this water's everywhere, and some of that ground may be great, some of it may be very marginal. And if it's just sitting there for, you know, months on end, that tells me you're not getting much recharge, right? So you're probably having a lot of evaporative losses at that point. So there's some happy medium that we can get to. I do, oh, go ahead.
Isn't that the reason though for the percentage?
Yeah,
We're kind of accounting for that, so
Yeah.
maybe it's the percentage to go up a little bit, or, cause it's kind of, instead of having to take everybody on an individual basis and do some kind of scientific
yeah,
discovery, we're trying to make a policy that kind of is easily applied over
yeah, we don't
large
want to.
swaths of land.
And again, up above too, if you don't wanna mess with evaporation, you just calculate that into the 10%, maybe you raise it to 12% or 15% or something. Then you just say that's all cranked into that.
Yeah, we could certainly do that. I wanted to get that number as high as I could, 'cause.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. To
But
really
we have to
encourage,
pass the red face test as well.
yeah.
So,
You know, those board members, they're gonna ask all these questions.
I mean, that's what we're here for, right? I mean,
Those guys.
I don't think we should sell ourselves short, but, I mean, it's common sense that, some of this stuff, so you might as well hammer it out now.
Right,
You wanna look at walking in there and saying, here's what we've got.
right, and that's, feedback from this group. Anybody online, is there anybody still left? I know we're a little over. They're all, Sebastian or anyone, did you guys have any
100%.
comments or thoughts on
Whoever
ideas?
goes through the meter, give us 100%, but.
No, all good discussion. I think we farm in Westlands, and they have a pretty good policy they developed last week that limited to, I know it's not apples to apples, but limited to transitional credit. You could carry it over up to a certain amount of use in a year. So stated differently, I'm not talking about transitional credits here, but maybe if there was recharged water, there would be a limit on how much you could extract in a year.
Yeah.
That way you don't potentially blow, pump a bunch of water in one area in one narrow time. So I thought it was creative, and it kind of, from our perspective, it does get to the same point that you can keep farming if you have those credits to use. You just have to kind of move some things around.
Yeah, good point. If I remember right, our policy does have a limit, an annual limit, doesn't it?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, all good points. Let Deanna and I work on this a little bit over the next, couple of weeks. And then we'll shoot another draft out
Yeah.
for everybody, and then you guys, and if you have other thoughts as you read through this, get back to Deanna, get back to myself, and we'll make sure to incorporate those, questions and comments into this. This is us throwing this out as an initial one. I will double check and look at what, the Eastern Tule on the leave behind. I'll look at, what Pixley's doing on the definition of the groundwater basin and start to get some of that information incorporated into here. There's some legal items that we want to add to this document, and then there's some definitions that we need to add for sure as well. So we'll work on this a little bit more, but I think it's a pretty good start for, the first cut. And again, I would encourage everybody to keep in mind that we want to encourage recharge. Right?
Yeah.
That should, whatever we're doing, can we answer yes or no to that question? If the answer is no, we gotta figure out a better way to do it.
As you're defining what a subbasin is, I think that under the land fallowing program, if they designate up front that they plan to sink water if it's available, and as the program states, they have to prepare that ground for that purpose up front. So, in that case, would that be considered a basin versus just an open field that's being used?
Yeah. So, that's a good question. We will come up with a definition and see if we can, how our definition would work with your land fallowing program. And see if we need to massage our definition depending on the type of behavior we're trying to encourage.
Yeah, that was my thought. I mean, you're trying to you're encouraging them to follow land, and then you're gonna get a double benefit if they're sinking, so.
Yeah.
would you really only wanna give them 50%?
Never easy.
Another encouragement, we put in another Laguna's policy, if you import water, you get a higher percent. So you might put 95%, because somebody's out buying water, bringing into the basin, so we ought to reward landowners for doing that.
That's everybody though, Mike, we're not a district, unlike Laguna here, so there wouldn't be any, everybody would have to import some water.
No, but let's say,
Oh, you're saying
let's
against
say
what, versus what?
Angola builds a sinking basin, we go buy water off the Bryant and bring it in, you wanna encourage people bringing it into Tri-County,
Right,
you know, 'cause they're spending money, rather than just getting water that was, you know, off the system and flooding it up in there.
It's a
yeah,
good point, because, you know, 215 sometimes sits there, because people are waiting for the free water.
Yeah,
And if you give them an incentive to buy 215 early in the, yeah, that might be a better deal.
I'll take a look at the Laguna policy as well and see if there's parts of it that we need to, incorporate.
yeah. I mean, everyone's different, but.
Yeah.
So that, you know, but it's just, any incentive we can give the landowners to bring water in, 'cause it's not cheap to buy water,
No,
so.
and it's not gonna get, it's definitely not gonna get any cheaper. This is gonna probably be the cheapest year that we've ever had in, for a long time. All right.
I hope so.
Before we end, we're close to ending, before we end, the next advisory committee is scheduled for the 25th, but I'm not available that day, so I'd like to move it up to the Monday, October 23rd. I would move it back one, but that is the day before the board meeting, Tri-County's board meeting, so if we could revisit the three-charge policy on the 23rd, and then we'll finalize it for board approval at the, I think it's November 2nd, board meeting.
And that, Tri-County board meeting for October 5th is tentative,
Well, it's a special meeting.
so they get, still gonna have it?
I
Yep.
believe so.
Oh, okay, oh, okay. Oh, okay, I thought.
I hope so, I think so.
Okay.
Sebastian, are you planning on being there?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, I'm planning on having it.
I'll be there. Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
good, then we know it's there.
Deanna, the 23rd at 10:30 is O&E for Milwaukee.
23rd at 1:30, okay, we'll do it our normal 10 a.m.
No, it's,
10:30.
she said,
Oh,
it's
there.
at 10:30, so you
10:30.
can do it at 1:30?
We could do it at 1:30, that's fine. Are you available over here?
I'll double check.
I'm just making up stuff right now,
Yeah,
it's fine.
I'll double check.
All right,
All right, but the board meeting's at 1 o'clock on the 5th.
on the 5th of October, there's
Yeah.
one, yes, and then November 2nd.
All right, are we good?
I think we're good.
All right, we're a few minutes over, so thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of your day, and we'll see you
you.
on either the
Thank
5th
you, David,
or the 23rd.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.